Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Sue Lawson, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Tony Park. Now, I'd like to start by, on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation and myself, acknowledging the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar people of the area, the traditional owners of the lands where the library services operate. We want to pay our respects to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders, past, present and emerging. And we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story, and thank them for their ongoing care for country. Now, before I introduce Tony tonight, a little bit of housekeeping for you. Now, on the bottom of your screen, I'm pointing with my mouse, but that doesn't help you. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. That's where you can type your questions, and please ask as many as you like. I'm sure Tony would much rather your questions than mine. So pop them in and we'll get into them straight away. So thank you for that. If you're on an iPhone or iPad, you may need to touch the screen just for that to pop up. Now, the webinar tonight's being recorded, and that means if you'd like to watch it again, you can do that. Give the guys a couple of days to get it up onto the YouTube channel. And also you can recommend it to your family and friends because you know, they're silly not being here. They're going to miss this tonight. Now, I'm delighted to welcome author Tony Park to join us tonight. Tony has been a reporter, a press secretary, a PR consultant, a writer of freelance and also fiction and non-fiction, and an Army reservist. But why he's with us tonight is that Tony writes action-packed books based in Africa. They're hugely popular, and his latest book, which we're going to talk about tonight, is called Blood Trail. I'll hold it up. I know it's back the front, but it's fantastic. Tony, thank you for joining us tonight.
Sue, it's great to be here, and thank you.
Pleasure. So, unlike the boy in regional Victoria, we're just out of lockdown. You're still in lockdown?
Yes, we are in Sydney. I think I've worked out a new joke. You know what the definition of an optimist is? It's an author that plans not one, but two book promotional tours 2 years in a row in lockdown. I did think I'd get away with it this year. Last year's tour for Last Survivor, the last book, was all cancelled. I chanced it, and I was very grateful to the Geelong Regional Libraries for saying that I could come this year, but unfortunately didn't quite make it. So stuck in the spare room again in Sydney.
And it's not as interesting, is it, having our bookshelves behind us, but it's good. It's good to have you here.
I've seen too much of this bookshelf, too much.
Now, Tony, I read a quote that since Wilbur Smith in his heyday, no one has written as well about South Africa than Tony Park. That's pretty high praise. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a funny one, Sue, and thanks for asking. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those funny things for an author is, you know, on one hand, I think it's incredibly generous and flattering to be compared to a man who is now in his 90s, you know, and has worked as an author since his 30s, and of course sold millions of books around the world, and still to this day has a very, very dedicated fan base around the world. I have read a number of Wilbur Smith books. Funnily enough, I didn't start reading them until after I started writing novels and after I was published and after I was writing novels set in Africa. And that's a long story how I got involved in writing books in Africa, which we may or may not touch on. But when I was published, I found myself getting into this routine when my wife and I were living half the year in Africa. And of course, before the advent of ebooks and audiobooks, when all we had was the good old-fashioned paper book, which many people still prefer, one of our biggest logistical challenges traveling around Africa, as we did, self-driving in an old Land Rover that we bought, was books. I was always paranoid about running out of books. So in our 4 storage boxes in the back of our Land Rover, we had the essentials. We had food, we had spare parts, we had stuff to cook with, and we had a box of books. So we always, the booze was hidden somewhere else in the car. So and when we inevitably started running out of books over the course of 6 months, one thing was for sure: you could always find a Wilbur Smith book. Absolutely guaranteed, hands down. Everybody's lounge room, everybody's secondhand bookstore, every backpacker's had a Wilbur Smith book. And so that's when I started reading. Now, as to the point of your question and the comparison, yes, but you know, some people think that's a good thing, some people don't. I personally am a fan of Wilbur Smith's older books. And I say that because in the 70s and 80s, or we started in the 60s, but particularly in that period in the 70s, 80s, he was writing a lot of contemporary thrillers with a big dollop of romance set in Southern Africa. And they were books like The Leopard Hunts in Darkness, set in Zimbabwe, a country that I love. Goldmine, which is a book that I really like, which was set in Johannesburg in the 70s. Dark of the Sun, set about mercenaries in the Congo. So if there's a similarity, it's probably that I write books that are mostly set in contemporary Southern Africa with a little bit of history in some and a little bit of romance. So I think that's where maybe we share some readers. And I think, if I am asked that question, I'd say, look, I'm a big fan, particularly of his earlier work, and I hope I'm still writing when I'm 90.
And that'd be good, wouldn't it? I'd be happy with that. What drew you to Africa? What was the thing that made you write about Africa?
My wife. Basically, we don't have kids. We've been married for about just over 30 years now. And when we were younger, we traveled a lot. And I think we were probably reaching a period in our lives around about, it was 1995, in fact, where we were getting older. Like I was in my 30s and early 30s, but I thought we're probably getting to a point in life where we might settle down. We still like traveling, but I was reaching a point in life where I had to get serious about writing, because the only thing in life I had ever wanted to do from the time I was a little kid was to write a book. It was my one aim in life. It was absolutely the only thing I wanted to do. And as you mentioned in your intro, I have worked with words as a journalist and a press secretary, as a freelance writer, because I couldn't, I don't say this in a big-headed way, I couldn't do anything else. I'm no good with my hands. I can't add up. I couldn't do science. So I thought, hopefully I'm on the right track. And so I did. I left work with the support of my wife in the mid-90s to try and write a book. And I failed. I wrote a book set in Australia and it went nowhere. I made a number of mistakes with that book. And of course, there I was. I had been given a shot at my dream. My wife agreed that I would take 6 months off. I'd leave my job and have like a sabbatical or whatever you call it. She would pay the mortgage, support us, and I would try and follow my, it didn't work. I failed dismally, absolutely. And it was scary. It was confronting. It was difficult. And I kind of drifted back into work on a freelance basis. But around that same time, Nicola, my wife, said, let's go to Africa, because we haven't been there. We'll have a safari holiday and tick that box, And I went into that holiday with that level of interest and planning and preparation. I had no idea what I was about to get myself into. Yeah. And what happened, to cut a very long story short, is in the course of a 3-week safari holiday where we drove ourselves in a little rented car around South Africa, Zimbabwe and Botswana in 95, we were hooked, absolutely captured. Hook, line, and sinker by the wildlife, the people, the landscape, the culture, the history, every whatever it was, it grabbed us, and we had to keep coming back. So we decided this once in a lifetime trip would be anything but. And we then proceeded to blow all of our holiday pay and savings on going back to Africa year after year, Southern Africa in particular, South Africa, Zimbabwe, sometimes visiting some countries you hadn't been to, like Namibia and Botswana. And so 3 years after my failed attempt to write a book, we found ourselves traveling around Southern Africa on our first big trip, where by a combination of circumstances, we were able to go for about 4 months, bought that old Land Rover that I mentioned with the box of books and the spare parts. And I had another go, had another crack at writing a book. I did things differently to the first one. And I think that probably the key things were that I enjoyed the process of writing what was that second book. And hopefully it showed through, because it was picked up by a publisher when I got back to Australia, the first publisher I sent it to. And it was published as a book called Far Horizon, which is coincidentally about a tour around Africa. But it was a thriller with a bit of romance set on a trip around Africa. So I think I found the inspiration that I needed in Africa, as well as becoming, I was going to say falling in love, becoming addicted to the continent is probably a better description.
And they say too that writers, you have to write and throw away 1 million words before you're ready, to produce your first book. You've kind of, the other thing they say about writers too is the second book syndrome is terrible, that people are worried about their second book and getting it out. You kind of beat that, I guess. How was your second book?
Well, it was really interesting because I had submitted my first novel, and I think the Far Horizon, the publisher saw some promise in it, but they wanted me to do a bit of work on it. It was an unusual deal in that I was kind of told, go away and do a lot of work on it and we'll have another look. So I did, diligently. I took on board the advice, and I was very hopeful. I'd had some positive signs, and you know what? I think, Sue, the other thing is I had thrown away all those original words, but I had learned from. I was starting to get a feeling for what worked and what didn't work in relation to plotting or not plotting, and whether I needed to do a lot of preparation work or whether I just needed to dive in and start writing, which is basically what worked for me. And you know what? One of the good things that happened was I sent that book back, and again, it was quite a long period of time before it was finally accepted. But in the meantime, I had just really cottoned on to something that now I knew I was right. I was doing what I was meant to do. The only thing in life I enjoyed writing. So before I even knew I had a publishing deal for the first book, I was well into a second book. And it was a book set in the Boer War, in the Anglo-Boer War. The interesting thing was, in the meantime, I'd been sent to Afghanistan with the army. So I was actually serving in Afghanistan in 2002 when I got an email from my publisher saying, open this email, it's good news. And which is good. I needed a bit of a shot in the arm at the time. I think it was not the funnest place in the world to be. So I got a deal. And then I came back to my publisher and I said, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And good news is, she said, they will give me a 2-book deal. I said, great, no problem. I've started a new book. I'm about 15,000 words into it, and it's set in the Boer War. And she said, stop. She said they were about to release a Boer War book. I think it was one of Peter Watt's books. And she said, don't, write something different. So I had to very quickly, while serving with the army in Afghanistan, in a desk job, I hasten to add, start writing another book. So you don't get a lot of time off when you're away, but there are hours of darkness where there's literally nothing to do, when you're not on shift and whatever. So I started writing a book that starts off in Afghanistan and winds its way back to Africa, and that became a book called Zambezi. So I was kind of fortunate enough to already be in the groove of having to start a second book, because all of a sudden I thought the last thing I want to do is lose this impetus of this deal. And because it was then a long time, another 2 years before that first book came out, I had already finished a second book and was started on a third book before the first one even was released. So it kind of set me up nicely for the future. And so to this day, I'm always a year or so ahead. I've just finished another novel now for 2022. So yeah, for me,
same characters or new again?
No, they're kind of, I have some that come back, like in Blood Trail, I've got a character who was in a few books earlier on. The new one for next year is another one of my recurring characters. So yeah, the other thing too is I think for the writers out there that are interested, you've got to be fair dinkum. It's easy to say, but and I think you could only do this game, as I'm sure if you enjoy it. That has to be your main motivator. And I think if you want to make a living out of it, it can be very difficult, and everyone tell you it's not possible. But I found it is a bit of a numbers game. If I live up to my end of the deal and produce a book a year, over 19 books, it starts to catch up, and I love it. So the second book thing was not a big deal for me. The funny thing is I didn't throw away that second book that I started.
Have you looked at it? Have you looked at it recently?
I put it in another book. So
did you?
2 years ago, I wrote a book called Ghosts of the Past. which just happens to start off in the Boer War. And I wouldn't want to let you know any trade secrets, but that may contain about 15,000 words that were written in 2002 that needed a fair bit of work, I must say.
But then that's what we're told, never throw anything away.
Never throw it away.
That's why my wardrobe in my office is full of paper.
I'm pleased to hear I'm not the only one. I look at all those dead trees.
Not at all.
Bad sometimes.
Tony, we've got a couple of questions already. First one's from Cassandra. And she wants to know, when you're researching for the medical information for your book, was there anything you found particularly interesting?
Yeah, look, so much fascinating stuff. And I don't know if we're going to touch on this later, Sue, but, the subject matter for Blood Trail is all about beliefs.
Yeah.
And it's about, traditional medicine and call it what you will, magic or belief systems as they pertain to the natural world, and also criminal endeavors in South Africa. The book is about rhino poacher, which happens in real life. They come from some of the traditional African cultures around the Kruger Park. They have a very strong traditional belief system, traditional medicine and healing as dispensed by the traditional healers. The Izangoma is part and part of society and fabric, and that can be the use of traditional medicines, plant-based medicines that are used in treating, common everyday illnesses, to things designed to treat, I guess, the mind and the spirit and things like that. And that's what we look at. Sandy, thank you for your question. I think probably the most interesting thing that I came across in researching this book was there is this kind of belief that some of these potions and medicine can give people almost supernatural powers. They can make people disappear or make them bulletproof. If you're a criminal, or even if you're someone working in the security industry, you would subscribe to these same beliefs. And you could equate that to someone wearing, in the Christian religion, wearing a St. Christopher medallion. Exactly the same. People will buy money, spend money to buy a silver St. Christopher medal to protect their loved ones. This is what we're talking about, same thing. But the interesting thing I found on talking to some academics involved in the field of beliefs and traditional medicine as they pertain to what is really a military style conflict, where poachers are heavily armed criminals who come up against security forces and are not afraid to shoot it out. And it is unfortunate to say that this results in a loss of life, and that poachers are killed in the course of their criminal endeavors because they're shooting at the national parks rangers and security forces. Now, what I learned is that when someone takes a life in the course of their duty, perhaps as a national parks ranger who might shoot a poacher, or even a police officer or a soldier in traditional African culture, they will need to put themselves through a cleansing ceremony. And the reason they do that is because they believe the spirit of the person they have killed will stay with them, will haunt them, and that will manifest itself in nightmares. They'll continually relive the incident in which they took that life. The person's spirit will get inside their head. It will start to affect their mental health. It will drive them mad to the extent that they might even take their own lives. Now, when I heard that, I thought, this sounds an awful like post-traumatic stress disorder to me, coming from a traumatic event, staying with the person, affecting them and causing them harm as a result, which is something as an ex-military person I've written about even in the course of my novels, and in Blood Trail I've worked it into Blood Trail because two of the characters have suffered grief in very extreme ways, and going through
PTSD from
both going through PTSD. Yeah, and here is a ready-made African culture with a long-standing series of traditional beliefs designed to not just look at what we would call PTSD, but just to deal with grief. Interestingly, and many, there are certain things of it that are, that involve smoke, that involve a ritual cleansing of the body inside and out, and rituals that are predicated on time. That great adage that time heals old wounds. So, if you have lost a loved one, there is a certain ceremony that you go through that's based around grief. And part of that ceremony will involve members of the immediate family being given what's known as an isipandla. Hopefully I got that right, which is a bracelet made of animal hair, which is designed to be worn until it falls off, made of leather and animal hair. And as it kind of deteriorates and falls off, the idea is by the time that is there to remind you of the person, of the loved one, so that they're in your thoughts all the time. And that by the time it eventually dries and falls off, you will have probably moved on to the next phase of your life and the next phase of your memory or grieving. Absolutely fascinating stuff, Sandy.
It is fascinating.
Touching, and perhaps and certainly something we could learn from. Yeah. Absolutely something that in our fast-paced Western, increasingly, less religious lives, that here are some well-grounded traditions, not just based about religion, but specifically looking at grief and things like that.
Yeah. And about not superstitions, but those things that we do, like in the book, I can't remember which character brought it up, but the Cosmonauts. We all do it. We all have things we do that are similar to what was going on with these characters in the book.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that was certainly the people that I interviewed in the course of my research, the academics studying this field, they have to be very culturally sensitive. The first thing they're at pains to put out is that this is not an African thing or a tribal thing or the preserve. This is a human thing. We look for beliefs, most of us or many of us in some way, whether we take that through traditional religions or animism or anything. But where beliefs come into play, it was pointed out to me, particularly in any culture or any society in history, is in what's known as a high risk, high reward situation. When the stakes are high, you will become more attuned to your beliefs. That there is that old saying we have, certainly in the army, that there are no atheists in foxholes. Yep. Religion becomes very important to people in combat. If you think, perhaps you may even know people in your extended family, we know of people that have lucky rabbit's foots and things like that, mementos and trinkets and talismans, particularly in battle, particularly in air crews. We read about it from the Second World War, rituals that soldiers will go through because they're in the ultimate high risk endeavor where the risk of failure is a loss of life, and the high reward is changing the course of history, is victory. Yeah. So military culture and history is full of people following these sorts of rituals. The Cosmonauts is a great one, and apparently it's a true story.
Do you want to share it, or we keep?
Yeah, I will. Yeah,
read it? So go for it.
It's not that risque, but the two researchers told me this: that Russian cosmonauts going into space to the International Space Station must have a wee on the tires of the vehicle that drives them out to the launch pad, and this is apparently a well-established cosmonaut tradition, to the extent that even foreign astronauts from, say, America or UK or continental Europe that are going up to the space station have to do the same thing. They have to have a little tinkle on the wheel of the bus that takes them to the space, because not to do that is to court disaster. Now, it sounds crazy, but the interesting thing is it's like one of these things when you hear, once your eyes are open to it, you're looking for it. I'm working on a non-fiction book at the moment. It's the memoir of a fantastic guy. He's a 97-year-old a veteran of the Second World War who was an air gunner in a Royal Australian Air Force bomber and a Liberator bomber during the Second World War. And after the war, he went to Africa in pursuit of adventure and lived his life as a game ranger, a big game hunter, and all sorts of worked on the set of Born Free, wrangling lions, and a most amazing life. So that's where my Africa interest in him comes. But he is half deaf. He's fit as a ball, this bloke. He's absolutely spot on, sharp as a tack. But he's half deaf. Literally, he only has hearing in one ear. And the reason for that is that in 1944, he and his crew and their Liberator bomber were engaged in bombing missions from Darwin over the Japanese-held islands in Indonesia in the Pacific. He was sick one day. He had a bad head cold and should have been grounded, because these were unpressurized aircraft, but they were bombing from 30,000 feet to stay out of the way of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. If anyone has flown with a head cold, you know how uncomfortable that can be.
Oh, it's not uncomfortable. It's agony time.
Isn't it? And that's in a fully pressurized aircraft.
Yep.
So these guys didn't even have the benefit of pressurized aircraft. So he was told he shouldn't fly, but he went to his skipper, his captain, and he said, I have to fly. And his skipper said, Yes, you do, because what they had observed as a crew. These are men who'd come in wartime service from all sorts of walks of life, professional people, tradesmen, educated people, some of them laborers, some of them horsemen like him, good grounding in education, science, and common sense. Peter, this guy, had to fly because they had observed that any crew that flew with a replacement member, something bad happened to them. They were shot down, the plane was lost at sea, the plane crashed. All these things happen, unfortunately, on a regular basis, or a member of the crew was wounded. Some calamity befell the plane. And on that basis, this group of men decided that their mate would fly, and he put his hand up to fly. And of course, he suffered terrible damage to his eardrums and his sinuses. Unfortunately, after that mission, they went on a period of protracted leave, which they knew was coming. And he spent his entire leave in hospital. So he put himself in harm's way rather than break that. Superstition is probably too trivial. This had become a life or death belief system for them. And that's what we're talking about in Blood Trail, this modern day adoption of people for criminal reasons going out and knowing they face the risk of death, and they will turn to just about any belief system they can to try and give them that edge. So, and it's tied into, ancient traditions going back to, people like the Sand people, the original inhabitants of Southern Africa, and their belief in certain rituals they could go through to improve their hunts and things like that.
We've got another question. Thank you for that, from Shane. I was going to ask you about your superstitions, but I better get to Shane's question. Now, Shane says that Africa is fertile ground for characters, and it is. Your characters are fabulous. Is there a lodge in particular you think of when you're writing about Africa and the people in your latest book?
Oh, Shane, my friend, great question.
I did wonder if you planted that one.
Talk about great characters. I've come across some very interesting characters even from Geelong. I've met airline pilots who've trained as safari guides. So but I'll declare my interest. My wife and I are investors in a place called Nantwich Lodge in Zimbabwe, in Wangi National Park, which is a place I've been going to for about 20 years, almost as long as I've been going in Africa. And it's an old national parks camp that fell into disrepair, actually burned down, was struck off the National Parks Register. But my wife and I and some friends and a business partner have rebuilt it as a safari lodge. And it does pop up in a few of my books. It popped up in a few of my books before I had a financial interest in it. But I love Zimbabwe. I love the Kruger Park and the greater Kruger Park. And I know Shane likes that particular part of the world as well. The great thing about traveling in Africa, wherever you go, is that it is uniformly welcoming and friendly, yet quite different in the different countries that you travel in, and in the different cultures where you become immersed, and people's belief systems and their traditions and their history. So it is a great continent to visit, and it's so diverse. But I do have a couple little favourite hidey holes around, and I think it's fair to say you can probably see a bit more of Nantwich Lodge in future books as well.
Yeah, and you can also, I'm pretty sure it was on your website, you can see the before and after. Is that
yeah.
That's right.
It's also, it's rich in its own history as well. That part of Zimbabwe as well. And it's a lovely landscape as well too. Lots of lions as well. So so I do have a few favourite places, and I put them in the books because I like using real places in the books, because part of that is me as an Aussie. And I should point out my wife is not from South Africa or Zimbabwe or anything originally. So we went as tourists, and I think a lot of the books, particularly my earlier books, are kind of exposing me, just as I do the readers, to different parts of Southern Africa and different elements of the history and the culture as we go along as well. This is, funnily enough, for a book that was written in lockdown in the spare bedroom of a 2-bedroom flat in Sydney, this has probably got more African traditional culture and beliefs in it than any of my previous books.
Certainly of the ones I've read, there's lots more of that sort of stuff. Now, what about the characters? How much do you are you drawing from people around you in Africa when you're creating these characters? Yeah,
good question. Like I don't base characters on people. Okay, I think that's a slippery, dangerous path to go down, unless it's a recognised historical figure, But I like to say that my characters are real in that I do shamelessly draw on real people's real life experiences. And so this one, the lead characters, I've kind of got two leading ladies. I don't have the old male and female hero. I've got two leading ladies in this book. One is the younger of the two. Her name is Mia Greenaway, and she's a safari guide. Now, she shares some qualities and experiences of safari guides that I've known, but I think she's probably emblematic of a change in that industry, which I've certainly seen in my time of my relatively short 20 years of traveling in Africa. It's more than 25 years, I think we're up to now. She works in an industry that was traditionally male dominated, without a doubt. You know, the safari guide, the young kind of buck male safari guide, you know, it was the ultimate sort of gap year job, and these dashing, handsome young fellows would be out there breaking hearts left, right, and centre. Well, like a lot of industries, that's changed. It's become a more professional industry, I think, in my time while I've been over there. And women have certainly more than staked their claim in that industry. And the interesting thing is, I know a couple of excellent female safari guides. In fact, I don't know any bad female safari guides. And I put this to somebody who helped me with my research. Her name's Taylor McCurdy. And she was, funnily enough, I thought she was fantastic, but she came to prominence during lockdown as far as I was concerned, because she was working on a program called Safari Live.
Oh, okay.
Live stream game drives from the Sabi Sands game reserves and other places in South Africa, where they were running virtual game drives in the African bush for people like me sitting at home in Australia in lockdown to get their daily fix of life in the bush. And Taylor was one of these guides broadcasting each day, and she happened to have read one of my books. So I got in touch with her to ask her for some help with this book. And I pointed that out to her. And the fact that female guides, I wasn't trying to be condescending. I was trying to choose my words quite carefully about how impressed I was, which probably does sound a bit condescending. But she said to me, we have to be as good as we possibly can be. Excellent. Not just because we strive in that, because that is the only way that they can, be treated equally or seriously, because of the way the culture is. They have to excel at their job just to be accepted. So there's obviously ground still to be made up in that industry, but they are certainly performing very well. I have another friend, Margot, who a couple of years was the field guide of the year in South Africa, as voted by her peers. And then I've got a female police captain in my book, Sannie van Rensburg. Yeah, and she is, again, not based on a real person, but I was interviewing a female police a detective in the course of research in this book about Sunny's new job. And, it's probably no easy way to say it, but to be a police officer in a country like South Africa, you have to be incredibly dedicated and brave and resourceful, and she is all of those kind of things. It's a bit of a high risk environment. But so the characters, there's a researcher in there who has shared some of the background of the researchers that I interviewed as well too. So my characters are kind of amalgams, but they definitely have real life experience. Yeah.
Do you spend time creating them, or do they grow organically as you write?
No, I did a number of things wrong. For me, writing my first novel, the one that never got published, is I followed this kind of accepted formula that you have to have a plot. You have to know the beginning and the middle and the end of your book before you start writing. And you have to know all the characters. You have to think up all the characters before you start writing them. And that was probably as difficult for me as trying to work out a plot, because I should add here, for people who are interested in writing, is you can do whatever you want, basically. And I think of the author friends that I now have, because I didn't know any authors when I started writing, I'd say probably 70% of them plot and the other 30% don't plot, like me. So I make it all up as I go along. And I found that for me, I can't think up a whole fully formed character. I can't. They do have to reveal themselves to me. And I think that's part of the fun for me, because just as I do not know what's going to happen next in a story until I start writing it, I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know who these people are. I don't know who the baddie is when I start writing the story. I literally don't. It can be
so you
fun.
have no idea of it,
Absolutely
a kind
no
of
idea.
endpoint.
No
Wow.
idea at all. It starts, you get a creeping suspicion about 2/3 of the way through. But then I find, there's no shortcuts in this business. Is because I don't have a well-crafted plot and a cast of characters. By the time I get to the end of my first draft, it's all over the shop. And sure, by the end, I know who the baddie is. But then at the beginning, they might have been the goodie, which could be a good thing because it puts the reader off balance. Or they might have been not very nice. So I've got to go back and make them nicer so they don't seem so bad. And so it's a surprise at the end. But I like it. It's a meeting in person. So you're a lovely person. And I'm sure you are an absolutely wonderful person. But I don't really know much about you apart from what I read on your website.
Give me 5 minutes and I'll change all of that.
And I want to learn all about young adult fiction so I can write it one day. But so we become good friends. But we reveal ourselves to each other a little bit at a time. Yep. We do that through conversations. That is dialogue. We do that through narrative. We tell our own stories about each other. And we can reveal ourselves by description, the way we look, the way we dress, the way we act, are we happy or sad. And I think for a writer, that's part of the fun for me, is discovering this person, peeling back their layers, learning about them as I write about them. So I make it up as I go.
Wow, I find, because I'm not a pantser, as I've heard it called. I'm more of a planner.
Good on you. I'm envious of you.
Oh no, don't be. You end up with more notebooks. But Rosemary Pringle Smith has said that she finished the book last night, so she will know where I'm going with this question without revealing it. She also said she couldn't put it down. It was very true to life around the South African lockdown environment and cool. Kruger Park and surrounds. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
But where I'm going with that, there's a twist. You had no idea that happened as you were writing.
No, it's a tricky, it's part of the fun, but it's also probably one of my greatest source of frustration. So what I sometimes do, in fact, I've done it with the one I've been working on right now, is I write the whole first draft, then I go back and fix it up. In fact, sometimes I'll write it all except the last 10 pages or so, because I still don't know how to tie it all up. And I figure if I didn't see it coming, hopefully no one else will.
No, I didn't.
That's the premise of it. Now, part of that as a writer is because I don't have a plot. And that's why I do say I am envious of people with plots. I couldn't do it, but I'm envious because it can be quite unsettling. I think I have made all this up, but now I don't know how to end it, and I don't know how to resolve it. And it can be the hard work. So, I mean, the premise of this book is that this rhino poacher in the Kruger Park, who's kind of caught on a live to air virtual game drive on a webcast, disappears. Oh, that's cool. Great idea to start a book off. Well, they're not going to start writing. How am I going to make this bloke disappear?
Where did he go?
maybe he really disappears. Who knows? Maybe it's magic, but I don't know. So you create a little bit of, it's uncertainty, but it's about trusting the process. I have to know that I will eventually work out who the baddie is. So if you didn't see it coming, don't feel bad. No. I didn't see it
either. I feel much better. Do you go back through when you're rewriting and layer hints once you know what's going on?
Yeah, well, I think what I do is I remove them, because what happens is my wife is always the first person who reads my books. And she's the sort of person who will start a book and, she'll read the first couple of pages when she's reading someone else's book. And then she'll go to the back.
Oh, she does not. Oh, Tony, no.
It drives me crazy. I couldn't believe it the first time I saw her do it. I didn't know there were people like that in the world. There are. They're out there. They live among us. They look
not only that, you married one.
I know. And I said, what are you doing? She says, well, when I start reading a book, I know what the end is. I said, oh, really? And she said, yeah. And then I said, well, that book, you knew the end. Yes, I was right, And I said, what happens if you were wrong? She says, I'm never wrong. And I said, so then having read the beginning and the end, what do you do now? And she says, well, if I like it, I'll read the middle. I said, well, you're not going to read my books like that. So what I do is I'll give her a manuscript without the ending on it, because I quite often might not have written the ending by that stage. Now she will then pick it up and start reading it, and she'll go, oh, yes, okay. I said, this is what's going to happen, and sometimes she's right. And I will then say to her, how could you know? How could you know that? I didn't know that was going to happen. She says, I know you. She says, you'll telegraph your punches. I will inadvertently be dropping hints without even knowing it. I'll subconsciously be setting myself up. So what a lot of my editing process is going back and actually removing a lot of that stuff.
Oh, yeah,
or maybe blurring it a little bit.
Because there was one scene that I went, what's this about? And then, but I thought, that's just a little
red herring.
Going. Now, Julie Phillips has got a really interesting question. She said, now that you've got a vested interest in Zimbabwe, would you consider incorporating a story about the great Zimbabwe ruins? She found them fascinating.
Yeah, Julie, that's a really, really good question. And I am going to put it right out here and be 100% honest that in having traveled to Zimbabwe, I don't know, dozens of times over the last 25 years, I've never actually been into the Great Zimbabwe ruins, which I'm ashamed of, and I will next time I go. Because of the way I travel, I don't get over that side of the country that often.
Also, can I point out, you're writing however many 1,000-word books while you're over there, so there's not a lot of spare time.
Look, I'm fascinated by that part of Zimbabwe's history and culture. And in my defense, I will say that there are some excellent archaeological sites in Wangi National Park, not far from where our lodge is. And they're much smaller than the Great Zimbabwe ruins, but they're thought to be of the same era and the same period. So yes, I'm fascinated in that those deeper levels of African traditional history and society. And there are even great sites such as Mapungubwe up in the north of South Africa, which again was a very kind of different sort of ancient African society to what a lot of people in Australia might picture, in terms of the scale of construction and the buildings and the level of infrastructure that was there. So yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing is, that could be an idea for my next book. Ideas just pop into your head from everywhere. So thanks, Julie. You might have put me onto a start for that one. So yeah, I'm interested in so many facets. The good and bad thing is you can never claim writer's block if you're writing about the continent of Africa. There's too much around, and then trying to think of an idea of story, it's a little bit hard when you're in lockdown. But if I was in South Africa or Zimbabwe, there would be story ideas popping up left, right, and centre all the time.
Let's talk about tracking, because that's a very big part of this book. I am absolutely amazed by trackers, and that these people, and when I say guys, Mia as well as the guys, I'm saying both, girls and guys, they can track while they're driving, like pick up bits as just that fleeting moment. Have you ever sat in the tracker's seat before?
I have sat up in the trackers. It's actually quite scary.
Yeah, that's why I'm thinking, you wouldn't get never nuts.
They're not very keen to let unqualified people, so it's actually quite dangerous. Not from necessarily animals, or that could be the case, but hitting your head on a low-flying branch and things like that. It's really interesting. I read a very good book called Changing a Leopard's Spots, written by a couple of expert trackers in South Africa. And I used that as a grounding or part of the research. I've certainly been on many drives and walked with some expert trackers. I'm in awe of it all the time, but you have to remember we've got people who are learning these skills from childhood and having them handed down ideally from their elders in their families, and just learning to read the bush, read your environment. And I kind of say that a good guide will show you stuff in the bush, but a great guide will read to you from the bush. They will look at how all these little things are integrated, and tracking is not just about the footprints. It's about, the way the vegetation has changed, what's been eating the vegetation, how an animal or a person has moved through a particular area. And so, and it's also when you've got to learn it, because one of the things that's happening is there's a number of good initiatives that I've seen happening in Africa, and the Moore family runs one of the big lodge owning families in Africa, where they have training academies now, because unfortunately with increasing urbanization and problems, some of the younger people from the traditional cultures are not getting the benefit of having that wisdom passed on. They may be orphans, or their circumstances may have meant that their parents have had to get jobs in the city, so they're trying to bring back some of that knowledge and bring back the respect for that level of learning and knowledge as it pertains not just to tracking, but also, uses of plants and things like that. It's absolutely fascinating. And I could talk and look at it all day, every day. I like to fancy myself as a bit of a tracker.
I was going to ask you, are you a tracker? Can you?
Yeah,
track?
like I was driving out of Manapools National Park in Zimbabwe very early one morning with my arm out of my Land Rover, and I saw some tracks on the ground. I thought, oh, they look interesting, And then I saw this animal run across in front of me, which I thought was a hyena. So we stopped up there with this animal across the road. And you are allowed to get out of your vehicle in this national park. It's a crazy anomaly. You shouldn't do it, but you're allowed to. So I got out and had a look at the tracks. My wife's saying, get in the car. And I said, well, I'm just looking at the tracks. It was a hyena. I was right. And I was standing there bent over in the middle of the road. I actually had another friend, Robert, parked behind us in a rented vehicle. And I said, there's another track here. And my wife said, get in the truck now. I said, no, I'm just having a look, because I'm like the big tracker now, I'm the expert. And I go, it's and she goes, lion.
Oh, no.
Okay, yeah, it is. It's a lion. She goes, behind you. And I turned around and just past Robert's ute and behind us was this big female lioness standing in the middle of the road, looking at my bum up the road as I was bent over looking at her tracks. And she'd crossed the road probably just before the hyena or just after, and she'd circled around behind us. And I would look back, wah! And I just leapt through the air, in through the driver's side door of the truck. So, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, Sue, I'll tell you that.
Yes. You would have been very good in the Olympics. They need one of those events.
Like a high jumper. I'm 6'6", so I high jumped into the car. But no, it's I'm in awe of trackers, and yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah. When you read about them, you just blows your mind that they can, and people tracking back, like trackers using their skills to avoid capture. It was
absolutely, yeah. I saw a picture. A friend of mine who's very senior in this particular world of anti-poaching sent me a picture of a poacher who had been captured, and he had made shoes out of an antelope's foot pads stuck to his shoes, so he looked like an antelope as he walked along through the bush to confuse the anti-poaching people.
On top of that, with the poachers, I think I guess it's something I hadn't thought about for a while with poaching, and I always tend to think of poachers as being, the guys in the cut-off pants and not very organised, and they're going in for their family because this rhino horn is going to feed them. What stunned me was the military precision of these people in this book. And is that really common now?
Yeah, very much so. And I think there's a couple of, you touch on some really, really key, really, really interesting points there. It's quite complex, but there are many facets to this crime. Now, it is an incredibly lucrative organised crime. Rhino horn is worth pretty well more per gram than anything in the world, more than gold, diamonds, or cocaine. And rhino horns are marketed in Southeast Asia, again, ostensibly for traditional medicine and beliefs, but actually more as a commodity, more as a tradable, saleable commodity. So there is a very sophisticated international organised crime endeavour that we're talking about. Make no mistake, the stakes are incredibly high. For the poacher on the ground, it's life or death. And sure, that poacher may come from an impoverished sort of area, but he is earning more than he could probably earn through any other legal means. And good, I mean, good successful poachers will reap the rewards of that. So poaching, of course, is a multifaceted thing. There are some people who poach bushmeat to eat in parts of Africa because they're hungry. There are some people who catch bushmeat, that is antelopes and things, simply because it's also worth a lot of money on the black market. The thing with these poachers is that it's like an arms race. Because the stakes are so high and the money is so high in it, is that it has progressed to the extent that the poachers themselves now have supply lines of expensive hunting rifles. There's certainly evidence of them using suppressors, silencers, what we would more associate with military endeavour. Some reports of night vision devices, which are very expensive, certainly technology in the form of mobile phones and things like that, explosives. There have been reports of poachers carrying hand grenades with them, which they will pull the pin on and put underneath the carcass of a rhino solely with the aim of causing harm to the investigators and the anti-poaching people. On the other side, you have a national park system that is incredibly motivated far more successful than most people would be aware of in terms of stopping poaching attacks. Yes, a lot of rhinos are killed. Yes, a lot of poachers get through, but so many more are stopped because they're employing absolute military grade sensors, electronic warfare in terms of monitoring systems and sensors, aircraft, increasingly well-trained rangers, and well-equipped rangers as well too, plus an array of other technology that I probably shouldn't even mention. So yeah, it is a high stakes, high risk environment. And interestingly enough, the soldiers on both sides of that war will still go to the traditional healer and will still do whatever else they can to improve their chances of coming home safe to their families that night, whether they're good guys or bad guys.
One of the main characters, and I'm not going to try and pronounce his name because I'll mangle it, but he's got the stuff that he chews, you know, and he's on the good side and he's also using it. And it absolutely, the Yumuti, did you call it? It's him in his tracks.
Traditional medicines, that's a generic term for them.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and it is because, like, I mean, I interviewed a friend of mine by messenger. I spoke to him in South Africa when he was working, I was locked down, and he had worked as a security guard in the past in Joburg. And it's public knowledge, fair to say, that that can be a high risk endeavor as well too. He was actually, I think, working in armed transit, like armored cars, cashing transit vans. Very dangerous job because they're targeted by violent criminals. And he said that when he was in that job, he would go to his local Sangoma, the traditional healer, and he would look for basically whatever help he could get. Yeah, you know, if it was something else he could do to give him that little bit of extra chance. You can read into it all sorts of levels. It could just be, you know, we do these things because it gives us a level of confidence, perhaps it will help us do our job, a bit more focus, you know, when we're doing our job, something like that. But it's belief systems. And as I said, you know, probably the most easily identifiable parallel for someone like me, a middle-aged white sort of nominally Christian background, is a St. Christopher medal or something like that. Someone has paid to give that to someone because it will look after them. Exactly what we're talking. Do
you have suspicions, superstitions, or rituals that you do when you write? I do. I'm going to bring mine out. I always have a candle burning. You can't actually tell it's burning.
That's nice. That's nice. Yeah. I like it. Look, I think I do, you know, and I will not do certain things, you know. I will not ever reread something that I have just written.
Oh, that's a good rule.
The day before. Now, that has transcended from a piece of practical advice into probably a deeply held belief, because again, you know, if you I dare say, if you're plotting, you're probably perhaps reviewing your work as you go through. Maybe you are, you know, that's interesting. Yeah, good.
Because I can get lost in a whole rewrite thing and spend the day rewriting instead of moving forward.
Well, I'm the same. And it's for that reason, because if I started reading something I wrote yesterday, I probably wouldn't write anything today. I would become so agonized over it. So I never look back. And that's become a ritual. I think it's a good piece of advice, but I think it's almost reached superstitious state for me now. I think if I ever did catch myself doing it, I would stop it immediately.
It's funny what we do. Now, we're fast running out of time. We've got about 4 minutes left. So if anyone else has questions, you are more than welcome to pop them in the Q&A section down the bottom and I'll ask them. But I wanted to ask you, Tony, because obviously we're all living in the time of COVID. And what I really loved, and I love the whole book, but what I particularly liked was the fact that COVID's there, but it's not a main character. It's influenced, you know, what's going on, but it's not sort of like this is what the pandemic's doing. How has the pandemic affected, I guess, poaching and the reserves?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because talking to experts in this field, particularly the female police detective that I mentioned earlier on, there was a bit of information about it initially. A lot of it was very kind of doom and gloom. There was initially a drop-off in poaching, I think, as everything was kind of locked down physically and literally, and even the reduction in international trade. All was a good thing. But as things started to bite and as the situation went on, poaching went back to its pre-pandemic levels, and has in some respects flourished because a lot of the areas that we're talking about where rhinos are, by the nature of the fact that their numbers have dwindled drastically over recent decades. I might say that countries like Namibia and South Africa and Zimbabwe are holding the line, but that means the rhinos are centralized. They're more concentrated in areas. And these, of course, happen to be areas that are also highly touristed. Now, tourism is a good thing because every day there are tourists, normally in normal times, driving around, looking at these rhinos, taking pictures of them. And there are rangers who are employed, who are out there. If you take away the tourism aspect, all of a sudden you've got a lot of empty bush. You've got a lot of areas with rhinos and not so many eyes on the ground, not so many tourists and safari guides. And that's where they've suffered. The vacuum left by COVID then became a problem. So I've worked that into the book. Yeah, look, it was a big call for me as to whether, you write a COVID book, you date it. However, it's a shared experience that pretty well everyone for the next 70 or 80 years, kids in the next 80, 90 years will know about it. But for me, it was more a practical thing because my thing as the Aussie who writes books in Africa is, I go and sit in the bush on my stoop and I draw inspiration from the giraffes and the elephant. Well, I couldn't do any of that. So my inspiration came from watching Taylor and her friends doing live stream game drives. Well, that's real. I can write that because I'm inspired by that. And talking to my friends because I couldn't be there with them. And so it just seemed to me that if I had to kind of make up a book from a spare bedroom of a 2-bedroom flat, I could do it about the inside of people's heads, about beliefs, and I could do it about what was happening, because I think I do still, as with the previous books, I draw my inspiration from what's around me, and it just happens to be COVID. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've got 1 minute left. So, and I only want you to talk about this for 1 minute because I'm insanely jealous. Where are you going Friday?
I've got my permission to escape Fortress Australia. My wife and I have got our exemption from the travel ban because we are ordinarily resident outside of Southern Africa. We've been waiting for our new South African residency visas to be renewed, which has taken several months, which is why we haven't gone already. So we're going back to South Africa this weekend. We consider ourselves extremely fortunate. I don't want to rub it into anyone because I know how fortunate we are to be in this situation. But we have a home over there, and we have been away from that home for the last 18 months. I have not been this long out of Africa for the last 26 years, except when I was away in Afghanistan with the army. So it was literally only a war or a pandemic that has kept me away from my other home. And I'm looking forward to going back to my other home.
And how long are you back there for?
For the duration until I'm probably allowed to come back to Australia. I don't want to try and muscle my way back into Australia. I'm going with a clear conscience and a clear decision that I have another home over there and I want to go to that home. I don't feel as though I should be saying, oh, and now I'll be ready to come back in 3 months' time, because that's probably not fair. It's not fair either, yeah. So yeah, I've missed my other home. So as much as I love Australia, I'm lucky to have 2 homes.
You are, and what a home. Tony, congratulations. Blood Trail is a fabulous read. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And apart from the last minute, I've really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks for your lovely interview style and your questions. Thanks very much. Thanks very much everyone else who asked a question as well. And thanks to all of my wonderful readers in Australia or South Africa or wherever you're tuning in from. Thank you for your support during these tough times, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you, Tony. And just before we go, as I said, tonight has been recorded, so you can go back and check bits that you want to have a look at, particularly after you've read it. Sorry, go on, Tony.
Oh, and I believe Torquay Books is supporting us tonight. So click and collect, get in touch, support your local bookstore. And
you'll find in the chat section, you'll find a link to Torquay Books. And the gang there are fabulous and they'll look after you. So grab a copy of Blood Trail. That'll keep you going for the next little bit. You won't want to leave the house. We've run a bit over time. My sincere apologies. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you, Tony Park.
Thanks, Sue.